Okay, thank you everyone for coming. First off, I think we'll start now. First off, welcome to the Ensure Your Audience Finds Your paper. My name's John Paul Chenzata. I'm one of the academic liaison librarians, and I'll be presenting the first section of the talk. And to my left is Tom Goodfellow, another academic liaison librarian, and he'll be presenting the end bit after I've done my talk. If you're interested, there's been several of these quick bite sessions, one on open access, social media, and a few others. They are both available now on the library YouTube, so if you've missed any of those, you can have a look at them. There was very good feedback on the social media one, so if you've missed out on that, it might be worth your while to have a listen. Again, it's only half an hour, so it's not too strenuous. And during the session, we hope to, at the end of the session, to have some time for some questions. Well, we're going to state the obvious first off, and the obvious is that, as it states there, invisible research is by definition low impact. If people aren't reading your research, it's not going to be able to make an impact anywhere. The other part of that statement is also important, and for my mind, the term strategic publishing. The idea is these days to be very aware of what audience you're writing to and where you want to get something published in. You're going to have to be a bit more strategic in your attitude towards doing that. You'll find that the audience that you are trying to focus on is really important. Is the audience mainly an academic audience, or do you want to go further than that? Do you want to go to a bit more public, etc., etc.? So it's up to you. Most people initially are going for an academic focus, which is what we're going to be doing through this presentation. This quote pretty much sums up something which is very, very true. For every person who reads the whole of a scientific paper, about 500 read only the title. That statement was actually made in 1983. So you can imagine what it'd be like now with the wonderful databases and especially Google Scholar. Now, I'm going to own up, when someone comes to me about looking for a research paper or information about a certain subject, as a librarian, I do go to Google Scholar first. So we're going to look at how you can maximise both focusing on the databases for your article and also about Google Scholar. If you actually got a group of students, which I did in architecture, and asked them what do they go to first to find a paper, they all put up their hand and all said Google Scholar. So if you learn how Google Scholar actually runs its system as to how it brings up results when people do searches, it's a good idea to pay attention to that and actually have a look yourself when you do a search on your own subject area to see what comes up as articles. They'll give you an idea about the title and the abstract, because we're going to be focusing today on how to make your title and your abstract stand out from the crowd. Okay. We're going in a different direction here. We thought we'd try this one to show you how it's important for a title. These are actually pre-published titles to famous books. Can anybody guess what they are at all? They're real, they're legitimate. These were the titles for pre-published books that became quite famous. Some of them were turned into movies that are famous, and some of them were turned into books that for old high school students have to read for the HSC. And I doubt that we'd be reading these if they were that titled. Anybody guess at all? No? Not even the last one? I'll give you a hint. The last one isn't a book about working for the university. It's actually quite a famous book. I'll put you out of your misery. Great Gatsby, Of Mice and Men, and of course Gone with the Wind. So you can see a title is important, And in this day and age of computerisation and so much information being out there on the World Wide Web and so much publishing going on, if you want your research to stand out, you do need to focus on a title and the abstract too. The abstract does play into it, especially if you look at the Google search. When you do a Google search, you usually get the title coming up and part of the abstract as well. It's also important when you submit to a journal and that journal is put into a database for searching. The title and the abstract are really important. I'm going to turn over to Tom, who's going to continue with what makes a good title, so I can save my voice.
Thanks, John Paul. Okay, so what makes a good title? We're not just plucking these out of the air. There is actually some research has been done into this. It's very, very small type, the reference there from the website, which then leads on to the primary sources. But then we've also got some references at the end, and you'll be able to look them up on the YouTube channel, hopefully this afternoon, if you want to follow any of this up. So, shortness. The research that we source shows that articles with shorter titles are both viewed and cited more frequently. It wasn't clear at the, whether viewed means actually the whole article's read or it's just opened, you can't really tell. But a shorter title is more likely to get more citations. 16 words was the maximum that one piece of research suggested. I'm not sure if there's a sudden drop-off at the 17th word or what the situation is there, but that's what the research suggests, and we follow the research. Obviously, you need to balance brevity with clarity. You don't want to lose the meaning. You use a phrase, not an entire sentence. And the example at the bottom here about hens, reducing it from 11 words to 7 words, just by turning it into a phrase, getting rid of some unnecessary verbiage. And I think it's clearer in its meaning as well as being shorter and punchier and more likely to get read. Straightforward and honest. People get aggravated if your title makes claims that the article itself doesn't follow up. This is the first time this has ever been done. This is a unique way of looking at such and such. And then you read the abstract and think, no, I've been doing that in my lab for the last 5 years or something. Okay. And the last one is the most important one, and this is what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes, which is using smart keywords. I'm using keywords here to mean words in your title and in your abstract, which can then interact via the search activities of another researcher and enable them to find your work. So, let's flip the perspective. Somebody right now in one of these offices around here is on a database or on Google Scholar, more likely Google Scholar, and they're looking for research, maybe in exactly what you're about to publish a paper about. What are they doing? Well, ideally, in my ideal world, they'd be sitting next to a librarian and they'd be planning carefully the exact search terms they're going to use. They're going to consider the synonyms of the search terms they're going to use, and then they're going to think about Boolean searching, and they're going to come up with some very elaborate strategy, and in that way, they will probably find your research if it's relevant, no matter what they do. So, if someone's interested in chromosome rearrangement in red hens under ultraviolet, in an ideal world, they'd be writing hens or chickens or poultry or bird, and ultraviolet or UV, and chromosomes or genetics or DNA. Something like that. That's not what people do. That's what I do, that's not what you do. Or they do. So, what do? They'll probably go to Google Scholar and type in hens ultraviolet DNA, something like that. What you have to do, first of all in your title, is use the words most likely to be searched for. Whether it's in databases or on Google Scholar, the first thing that the search algorithms, or the most important thing that the algorithms search for, is words in the title. Now, what I'm about to say is slightly speculative because both in the databases and especially on Google Scholar, the way the actual algorithms work is commercial in confidence, they're all secret. But you can kind of reverse engineer, and librarians who have more time on their hands than I do have actually spent time interrogating the way the searches work and working out which are the major factors. And keywords appearing in the title in all databases is probably the single most important, he said. Most databases, by the way, when you search on them, I hope you're aware of this when you're doing searches on the databases that you use, most of them will rank their searches by relevance. And when I say rank them, when you do a Google search for ABC Rake, you're hoping that something about the TV show Rake is going to appear at the top. Okay, it could be something else. It could be some company in Idaho called ABC Gardening Tools, and that might come up. But you're hoping that it can figure out what's the most likely relevant one to you. That's the ranking, pushing the important stuff to the top. You are trying to construct your title so that your work gets pushed to the top of a relevant search. Who's ever visited page 2 of a Google search? Nobody. So, unfortunately, you can't use all of the keywords in the title. Otherwise, it'll end up looking like a search string. Red hens and chickens and poultry undergo spontaneous chromosome DNA and genetic rearrangement. You're not going to do that, but there are ways around that. But in the title, try and use the ones that you think are most likely to be searched for. If you're not sure, do some searches yourself and see what the most commonly used words in your research area are. Now, in Google Scholar, it's similar, but the most important aspect of relevance ranking, what gets pushed to the top in a Google Scholar search, is the number of citations. If you've ever done a Google search and there's a cited by number underneath each article, on a broad search you'll get thousands on the top or hundreds on the top few articles, and then it'll go down. So it's a bit sorry to confuse matters, but it's a bit like the chicken and the egg. You need to get the citations to get the ranking on Google Scholar, but you can do what you can. So, the second thing you can do after putting those words in your title is putting them in your abstract. So, when someone does a keyword search on a database, it varies from database to database. Sometimes they're searching the full text, sometimes not. But they're always searching the title and the abstract. And a database is a discrete set of a few 100,000 articles, and anything that matches those search terms will appear somewhere on the list. You might not be ranked first, but if you use the correct synonyms, the correct words in your abstract, then it will get picked up by the databases. So you can vary the terminology a little bit more in the abstract. In a way, the abstract, if the title is the first thing people look at, it's a bit like a book title, as we were talking about before. You're not going to pick up a book in a shop called A Thing That Happened, but you might pick up a book called Of Mice and Men, because you like the title, because it's a Hamlet reference or whatever. You might then say, OK, I'm vaguely interested in this book, and then you read the blurb on the back of the book, and it gives you some more sense of what it's about. That's what the abstract does for people. It gives them a greater sense of what it's about. So, use synonyms where possible, and possibly, if you have room in the abstract, to repeat keywords. Frequency of keywords appearing also appears to be a factor in the ranking on databases and Google Scholar. If you use the same word over and over again, and someone searches for that word, your word will go to the top. So I know it's slightly contradictory to use synonyms and repetition, but do your best. Maybe, if you have the energy, maybe play around with some searches and see what comes up when you're searching in the same area. Now, you want an abstract to be clear and accurate, obviously, conveying the content. And some kind of a subset of that is consider the NESB audience. We are lucky, those of us working in the Anglophone world here, that English tends to be the lingua franca of so much academic discussion. Remember that when someone in Tehran or Santiago or Xi'an is looking for things that English might well not be their first language. You want to avoid idiom where possible. You want to be as clear as possible to someone and not create any unnecessary obstacles for their understanding. And the final thing on this, background, aim, approach, results, conclusion. Have people seen this model before? This is just more of a general model. A few of you have. This is just a more general model of how to write an abstract. You've only got so much room. You tell people, not much research has been done in this area. We thought we'd research such and such. This is the approach we took. And spoiler alert, here are the results and the conclusion we reach. Well, spoiler alert, the conclusion will be further research is needed in this area. But if you use that structure for your abstract, pretty straightforward. It's a natural way of writing. It's also a natural way for people to understand your work. The human brain is very much hardwired to understand a narrative through line. So if you can create some simple narrative through line, as you would when you were teaching a class for the academics among you, then it just firms things up in people's brains. So, excuse me. We've talked about the importance of keywords in both the title and the abstract. When you submit to a journal, 99% of the time you'll also be asked to submit author keywords. So this is your chance to go nuts and include all the synonyms that you couldn't leave it into the abstract. You make them as broad as possible and as likely to pick up as many readers, remembering that a lot of them won't have English as a first language, so they might not necessarily use the smartest terminology. The last chance, so author keywords will get picked up by most databases. When a journal article gets put into a database, there's processes that go on. Usually, the author keywords from the journal that you submitted with your article will end up as part of the metadata on the article in the database, but not always. It depends on the database. Don't ask me which is which, because I looked at it a couple of weeks ago and I've forgotten. But most of them will include author keywords. Nearly all of them will also apply their own keywords. So Web of Science, for example, when a document goes into Web of Science, someone will have looked at it at Web of Science and applied certain keywords to it that they think might be valuable from the user searcher end. In some cases, like Medline and PsycInfo, you'll get the very specific subject headings, and they're kind of hardwired into the whole system. So depending on what databases you expect people to be looking for your kind of research in, it might be worth really concentrating on those author keywords to make them even more findable. Every database is a discrete set of, let's say, 500,000 articles, and if someone does a search and your word is either in the keywords that either the database or yourself have provided, the abstract or the title, it will appear in the list. And then your second consideration is ranking. Sorry, and then your second consideration is ranking. Okay. This is the next step. Looking around the room, some of you are enviously youthful. The key to helping people find your work as you progress throughout your career is to own your researcher identity. I can't tell you how many people we found from the university on, say, the Scopus database, many of whom have 4 or 5 separate researcher IDs. Excuse me. You can imagine people, I might go have one publication as Tom Goodfellow, one as T Goodfellow, one as T.E. Goodfellow. Maybe I change my name. Maybe I move from Sydney to another university. All of these things can really splinter your researcher ID, and means that when someone finds an article that they really like by you, they click on your name and your other articles don't come up. So it's really good idea at this stage of your career, no matter where you are, in fact, to take an individual ID. And the way that we recommend doing that at this point is ORCID. ORCID.org. If you're going to do one thing after this session, go to ORCID without an H, ORCID.org, sign up and get a number. And then place that number every time you have a website on the university website. Every time your work is disseminated anywhere, have that ORCID ID, and that means when people find it again in 10 years' time, they can follow all the subsequent work you've done. Now, there are other ways of doing this. Some of them have been talked about in other quick bite sessions, so we won't dwell. But the reason I would specifically recommend ORCID, the general point that it seems to be emerging as the worldwide academic standard ID. But here at Sydney we have two specific reasons. One is it will be linked to IRMA. Your IRMA profile with the research office is going to require an ORCID ID at some point, possibly even this year. And at present, research grants from the ARC or NHMRC are not yet required to have ORCID ID. You are encouraged to have an ORCID ID, and it's got to be the stupidest way of getting the disapproval of the ARC not to spend 2 minutes getting an ORCID ID. And it's anticipated that at some point, whatever that means, both ARC and NHMRC grants will require you to have an ORCID ID. So there's no good reason not to have one, basically. There are other things, as I say, there's your Google Scholar profile, there's your Web of Science, Researcher ID, there's various other places where IDs can get splintered and broken up. ORCID seems to be the most straightforward way of gathering it all into one place. So that's the bit about helping people find your research 10 years from now. You publish your first paper today, 10 years from now you've published however many papers, and they can find them all in one place with one click. Okay. Quick plug for me and John Paul and our colleagues, some of whom are in the room. If you have any questions or you need any help, any aspect of publishing research, feel free to contact your academic liaison librarian. There's the link for you. There's also some further reading. And as a last point, just to reiterate what was said at the very start, all of these quick bites are being recorded and placed on YouTube. You can just Google University of Sydney Library YouTube and you'll find them all there. This one should be available sometime this afternoon or tomorrow morning. So if you found it useful, if you'd like to follow up any of these references, or if you think your colleagues might find it useful, feel free to spread the love. Okay, we have got about 5 minutes left. Are there any questions? Yeah. Okay, for the recording, this was a question about clarifying what I mean by author keywords. Author keywords are the keywords that when you submit an article to a journal, part of the sort of the form that you have alongside your article will often have a section for author keywords, and they'll allow you, I think it's normally kind of in a few dozen keywords that you can include additionally to what's in your title and abstract. And this is where you can play around with synonyms a bit more. You might even want to consider using slightly old-fashioned terms, terms that are used in different geographical locations, like motor neuron disease versus ALS. You can kind of get around those geographical variations in your author keywords. Most databases will harvest those keywords from the journal article and include them so that when people are searching on those databases, the author keywords will be taken into consideration when their results list come up. Does that answer the question? Oh, really? Okay. You have? Some haven't? I'm getting some nods for the recording. I'm getting some nods and some shaking of heads. So if you're not asked for author keywords, you can forget that bit, I guess. It makes the keywords in your title and abstract even more vital.
Could I also suggest, if that isn't there, contact the journal that you're publishing in to find out if they do have... I'm surprised because most of the journals I've seen most of my career in the last few years have got that provision in them. So maybe you should check with the journal publisher, see if that's available there.
Maybe they provide their own. Any other questions? Yes.
Is there anything that's discipline specific that you would advise, like in terms of scientific versus humanities versus social sciences?
That's a difficult one because we're all focused very specifically on our disciplines. In the more kind of health-based world, which both myself and John Paul are very familiar with, a lot of it's terminology and having the correct terminology in your variations of terminology that can change quite wildly in different geographic areas. Does anyone have any suggestions for more humanities-based? It's a good question, though. Come to the next Quick Bite session next semester.
Just to further answer that, those references there, if you've noticed, the second one actually is more tailored towards a scientific paper. The first reference there, which I found very good, is actually looking at legal articles. Even though they're looking at legal articles, what they say about the keywords and the title and the abstract is actually applicable. So I would follow up maybe the second one. It's actually written towards a particular journal, but it has a lot of good things in there as well. And yeah, the last one is more related to citation, download information, and can apply to an overall situation. I did a literature scan, and there's not that much out there written in journals about this topic, so I pulled out the best I could. If you have a mind, you could go and do a Google search and type in the topic and look at what comes up in Google. There's all these very good places, other universities included, that have good pointers towards writing a good title and abstract. But in terms of actually articles about this topic, these are some of the best ones I could find. Yeah.
And your own ALLs might have good advice in your own subject area as well.
If you've got concerns in that area, just contact us and we can sit down with you and we can help you find something. Thanks.
Yeah.
So just two quick questions. First of all, this is fairly specific. Is there any advice you give about using verbs and rules and things like that?
Yeah.
So there's a way that you put in a word like podcast versus podcasts or podcasting.
Yeah.
Do you want to do this or shall I?
No, thank you.
Most databases, and certainly Google Scholar allows for that, it effectively truncates itself. You know, on most database searches you do podcast star, and if the searcher has done the smart thing and sat next to a librarian while they're doing it, then they'll be doing that too. And I think, I wouldn't know the stats, but I imagine a fair number of people would. In individual databases sometimes can be a little bit dim-witted about different versions of the same word, but if you're trying to anticipate what people would search for, they're more likely to search for podcast than podcasting, for example, I'd imagine, and just try and construct your sentence in that way without losing clarity, perhaps. Yeah, for the record, the question was about different versions of the same words. Okay, well, it's past, and this is a quick bite, so thank you all for coming. On behalf of myself and John Paul, thanks for coming, and keep an eye out for any more quick bite sessions in the future. Thanks a lot.